For those of you who know who I am, hello. For those of you who do not, a quick primer. It goes like this. I'm Scottish. You can hear the accent. Some of you may find this a troubling accent. I'm going to clue you in as to how we make this work. I've done as many audiences as it works every time. How many of you have children? Please put your hand up if you've got kids. Good. That means the planet will be populated. That's good. How many of you have ever seen a film from DreamWorks called Shrek? Listen. I have exactly the same accent as Shrek. I will prove this to you. Donkey. Fiona. I live in a swamp. Now, if you can understand Shrek, you can understand me. Now, with that in mind, let's try and understand something a bit more complex and a bit more tragic, which is this. How many more things can go wrong? I mean, the financial crisis happened like so long ago, I was relatively young. And yet Europe is still stuck with many problems. And that's what we're going to talk about. Now, how many more things can go wrong? So let's think about this one, right? So I like to call last year the Katy Perry problem. And I'll explain why in a moment. You see, remember Greece and all that stuff in the summer? Well, Greece wanted an end to austerity and to stay in the Eurozone. They also wanted effective debt reduction, and so did the IMF. And they wanted democracy to be respected, because every single voting district in Greece said, we're not doing this anymore. Now, at that time, I said to my wife that I wanted to be married to her and to be in a relationship with Katy Perry. And she said, this is the Katy Perry problem. You see, ultimately, these are orthogonal choices. You don't get to do both, and the outcome's going to be divorce. Now, what we found out in the Greek crisis was Mario, I thought he was a Jedi, because he's been keeping Europe afloat with monetary mind tricks since 2008. You know, you do not need OMT, right? You know, this is it. And it turned out he's a bit of a Sith Lord, because what he did was a highly dubious thing, which was squeezing the liquidity to ordinary Greeks through their banking system to the point that the government capitulated. And this is the overt politicization of a non-political institution, and that's somewhat troubling. It's even more troubling when the Greek government themselves took their only weapons off the table, namely default or redenomination. Now, that left a bit of a malheur in terms of European politics. Everyone looked pretty bad for the way the Greeks got a kicking in the summer. But, of course, it was going to get worse, because how's this working out for Greece today? Now they've signed their third memorandum, and it's more of the same policies. Well, as you can see, the debt's not going anywhere, and they're back into recession, so, hey, victory for that one. Now, any idea what that picture is? That's the life jackets left by migrants on one dump in the Isle of Lesbos. That's how many migrants are coming through Europe. Now, Merkel, after giving, well, through Schäuble, giving Greece a heck of a kicking, didn't look too good. But then she did this amazing thing. She said, Germany's going to take 2 million migrants. And everyone went, oh my God. Now, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. The replacement rate of the German population is 1.4. They don't have enough people. They're getting older. They have extremely expensive pensioners. So what you need is lots of young people coming in, having kids, and paying taxes. This is a no-brainer, right? But then there was the Cologne incidents and the whole politicization of this, the rise of the ugly nationalism we thought had been gone from Europe, all of which is undermining support for the EU even further. And now the Brits are off. And this is, you know, really, talk about a trifecta of bad stuff. Because what happens now, years ago, David Cameron, when he comes in, says, I have this annoying wing of my party, and they won't shut up about Europe, so I'm just going to give them a referendum. Everyone will say, let's stay in, and we can stop this happening. And then, of course, Europe goes off the rails, has a self-enforced depression, gives the Greeks a kicking, and now has a migrant crisis, which has emboldened everyone in Britain to say, well, hang on a minute, do we really want to be a part of this? And if they do vote to go out, who's going to go voting to go back in? The Scots. So my mob will be out because they're out, because they can't get in, because the other ones want out. Are you following this? It's nuts. And of course, the Scots have got a new version of the Katy Perry problem. They want to be in the euro and have a big fat welfare state. Good luck with that, with the tender love of Dr. Schäuble. So how is Europe doing despite all that? Here's a couple of charts. Well, everybody's 10-year bond yields are looking pretty bad, but it doesn't exactly inspire confidence. But the other one is industrial production. They haven't even got close to where they are from before the crisis. This is what Larry Summers talks about, secular stagnation, or perhaps a permanent form of recession. And finally, the whole point of Europe was meant to bring people together. In 1994, the first column shows you the per capita of Germany that these countries had. And you can see how you've got convergence in living standards going up to the crisis. But look at the last column, and look particularly at Italy, never mind Greece. Italy used to have, back in 1994, 94% of the GDP per capita of Germany, and now they're down to 75. Everyone is worse off than when they started, even the Irish. And they managed to spin air into gold looking at these figures, but that's a different story. Now, given all this, who's going to tell us something we don't know? I'd like to welcome Yanis Varoufakis to the stage. This way.
Good morning, everyone.
Now, Yanis, when you first jumped to public consciousness, or at least my consciousness of you in the public, one of the things the media used to love to point out was you were a game theorist. So Yanis Varoufakis, he's a game theorist, we're doing games. So I can imagine all these people looking on their Bloomberg terminals going, what the hell's a game theorist, right? But, you know, look it up. But it made you into some kind of Jedi figure, that somehow you were 10 moves ahead of everyone and this is going to change everything. Now, as a game theorist, certain things matter. A dominant strategy, credibility, exits. What went wrong? Where was your credible strategy? How come you got into a situation whereby we ended up with Greece in the position it is? What happened?
Well, the reason why, as you know, I disagree with your view that we wanted to have our cake and eat it was because I believe we had a credible strategy. And the credible strategy was very simple. The European Central Bank was put in a situation that Mario Draghi didn't want to be in, but he was forced in that situation by the rest of the troika of creditors of Greece to threaten us with bank closures, to say to us from actually day 3. I got into the ministry on the 27th of January. On the 30th, I had the president of the Eurogroup coming to visit me, a courtesy call. Not the best way of beginning our wonderful friendship. When he said to me, either you accept the program of the previous government, which, by the way, we were just elected to challenge and to reframe, or your banks close. That was, you know, instead of a hello, how are you? But of course, we were expecting that. And our credible response to that was, you close down our banks, we restructure 27 billion euros of debt, which was still in Greek law and held by the ECB. And the reason why that was a credible strategy, I remain convinced of this, was because look, why is the Eurozone still alive? Why is the Euro still with us? It's because of Mario Draghi's and the ECB's quantitative easing of 60 to 65 billion being printed every month to support the creaking structure of the Eurozone. Now, that program is challenged very fiercely by the Bundesbank. That program would collapse if even a small amount of paper that has been purchased by the European Central Bank is restructured. And I could do that. So what went wrong? Well, halfway through the negotiations, I realized that members of my government had signaled to Draghi that I would not be allowed to carry out the threat. So it's like being sent to battle with, you know, a small but significant weapon, only to have it disarmed behind your back just as you're walking into the terrain.
Right. Well, there you go.
There you have.
Don't pick a fight with the Germans when you're armed with a stick of butter. That would be number 1. All right. Moving from Greece to, doesn't make sense, to Europe more broadly. When we go back to 2008, 2010, the response everywhere was a kind of expansionary moment, an expansionary expansion. Then the Brits came in with the Tories and they pretended to do austerity for an expansionary contraction, but it's really about just reducing the size of welfare bills. That's their version. And then the Eurozone keeps going on this contractionary contraction. They even stopped pretending it was expansionary. The IMF has said this is nonsense. The US Treasury has said this is nonsense. Practically every academic economist I know thinks that it's nonsense. Why are they doing this? Why doesn't it stop?
Two reasons. First, compare and contrast the approach to the crisis in Britain or the United States with that in Europe. In Britain and the United States, once the whole thing went pear-shaped in Wall Street, the City of London, Northern Rock, and all that, the powers that be, the politicians and the bureaucrats, sat around the table, panicking, and they asked themselves the simple question: how do we stop this crisis from consuming us? Right. In Europe, they asked a different question, not the same question. They asked the following question. We have these rules, which clearly are not possible to enforce. Now, so how can we pretend that we're enforcing them? It's not the same question. The answer you get from the second question is very different to the answer you get from the first question. So that's one answer to your question. But beyond that, look, the euro is a very strange beast. It's a hybrid. It's neither state money, because there is no state issuing it. We don't have a state, we have many states. So we remarkably created a central bank without a state, and we have states without a central bank. Yeah? That's unique. And that has never happened at any point in time anywhere else. So it's not really state money. But at the same time, it's not a fixed exchange rate regime. It's one currency, a single currency. So right from the beginning, those who designed it had not worked out whether this is something like the gold standard, where what you have is you have monetary union, but no surplus and deficit recycling mechanism. And the only thing that keeps it together is the threat of expulsion or exit. So there were those who think in those terms about the euro, and there are the others who see it as a prelude to state money. But that conversation was frozen in time in 1992. And of course, when you freeze such a conversation in time, then reality comes and wallops you. And then you go into this mindset of trying to work out ways to pretend that you don't have the crisis that you're having. And the result, of course, is extending and pretending. Like rogue bankers in the Eurozone, the powers that be, the Eurogroup, the Troika, decided to extend and pretend, to carry on pretending that our economies are solvent by means of piling up more unsustainable debt on existing unsustainable debt. And, you know, a 10-year-old knows that this cannot end well.
Yeah. So that's the first crisis. Let's move, given the session's title, to the second one, the migrant crisis. Now, despite this accent, as you know, I'm an American. You can tell, right? And the most famous Syrian refugee to come to the United States is Steve Jobs' father. Now, could you imagine if he didn't come to the United States, there would be no Apple, et cetera, the world would be a very different place. Now, Germany's running out of people. Where I come from, Scotland is half empty. You could take the entire migrant crisis, dump them outside of Dundee, and no one would notice. The place is vacant. The food would get better. I mean, there are multiple. It's all true. There are multiple upsides to this, and instead of which we managed to build a Europe coming out of the economic crisis that is emboldened petty nationalist forces, which are ugly. It's the ugly side of Europe. Why is it that Europe's elite are unable to make the positive case for migration?
The short answer is that we had our 1929 moment in 2008. Just like after 1929, the gold standard started fragmenting, the common currency of that era, and very soon after that, Europeans started turning against one another and against a Middle Eastern people, the Jews. Yep. Similarly, with our generation, our common currency, our gold standard, the Eurozone started fragmenting. Very soon after that, it was a beggar thy neighbor strategy that took over within, and denial. One proud nation turned against another. The Germans hated the Greeks hated the Germans, everybody as always hated the French, the British wanted out. And
so European politics
and of
is
course,
normal,
following after that, if on those flimsy foundations of a disintegrating union, you add an exogenous shock, especially one that is mostly Muslim and mostly alien to the worst parts of Europe's societies, the bigots, the nationalists, the racists, you end up with what we've ended up with. But you mentioned Scotland. I come from a place called Greece. We don't have a problem with refugees. Right. We are a refugee nation. We're a bit like the Palestinians. We didn't have a state for 400, 500 years. In 1991, when the Iron Curtain collapsed, Greece is a country of 10 million around, and we had, within 5 months, we had an influx of 1 million refugees who actually stayed in Greece. They were not in transit. Half of Albania moved to Greece to begin with, large parts of Romania, and so on and so forth. We handled it quite well, but we were not disintegrating like we are as a result of an impossible fiscal consolidation problem. When Lebanon, when Turkey, when Jordan can take millions of refugees, can't a Europe of 500 million people who are very rich by world standards handle this petty little refugee crisis? Of course it can. The fact that it's not doing it is simply a reflection on the loss of the integrity and the soul of the European Union as a result of that terrible architecture which is collapsing.
Yeah. Now, continuing along these happy themes that we're discussing, so the Brits, we're going to want to talk about Brexit in a minute, but before that, let's do something else. If you look at the vote shares of centre parties, now you weren't here yesterday, but Tony Blair was here yesterday. He was talking about the importance of centre parties, the traditional left, the traditional right, holding Europe together. And if you look at Greece and Portugal and even Ireland and all the ones that were under pressure, their vote share's gone to below 50%. Nobody believes them anymore. And we have all sorts of parties, from Syriza all the way through to a re-energized National Front, to UKIP, to whatever on the right. And everyone's saying, we don't want to play this game anymore. Now, it sounds like, given the economic crisis, given the migrant crisis, we shouldn't be playing this game anymore. Should we be looking forward to a breakup? Should we accept that the Catalans should go, the Scots should go? Should we just basically break it up and start it again? Is that the way to go?
No.
I feel a Katy Perry moment coming on.
Well, let me be a bit thoughtful for a second. Nobody can accuse me of being a great admirer of the European Union institutions, right? But I'm saying this to you, Mark. The disintegration of the European Union is going to push us into a postmodern 1930s. What's going to happen is we're going to have a deflationary Deutschmark zone east of the Rhine and north of the Alps, which is going to convert the millions of working poor in Germany and in other parts of northeastern Europe into unemployed poor, with prices falling, with investment collapsing, with factories closing down. The rest of Europe is going to become a cesspool of very high inflation following the depreciation of the new Latin currencies and Greek currencies and all that, together with very low investment. And the only people who will benefit from that, the only people who will thrive from that will be the ultranationalists, the Marine Le Pens, the Golden Dawns, all those nasty people who are rising up as a result of the gross failures of people like Tony Blair.
Fair enough. Now, given this, should the Brits be off? In the sense that, you're absolutely right, I totally agree with everything you said, but if I'm a British politician, right, even if I woke up one day as David Cameron, which would be impossible because I'd need to be carved out of cream cheese and baked in the oven. I mean, he does look strangely like that. But anyway, if I'm a British politician, why do I want to stay close to this mess? And more importantly, if Britain leaves, isn't it really Europe's problem? That is to say, it's more important for them, for the Brits to stay in as a counterweight to Germany and that powers you're talking about. And for the Brits, they're already out. They have the pound, they're never going to have the euro. What's the big risk for them? Does it even matter for them if they're out?
Well, there's no doubt that if I were British and I had a vote on the 23rd of June, I would be tempted to give Brussels a bloody nose and Cameron and vote for Brexit. But I wouldn't. That's why I'm campaigning, as we speak in Britain, for the stay vote, for the yes vote, not for the no vote. The reason is this. It's twofold, actually. First, it is a major error to imagine, if you're sitting in Britain, on the British Isles, to imagine that the European Union is something constant out there, and you have to make up your mind as to whether you want to be part of it or not. Whether you're better off or worse off in or out. Why? Because the European Union is not a constant. It is disintegrating for the reasons that we discussed. And a Brexit would make this disintegration faster, and it will push us into that kind of divided continent, which will become a black hole that will consume Britain as well. So it is not in the interest of Britain to get out of this terrible Europe, because if they do, it will become even worse, and it will suck them in. That's reason number one. Reason number two is because of the Hotel California dictum. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. By this, what I mean is, when I talk to my friends in the Tory party, and yes, I do have a lot of very good friends in the Tory party, which just goes to show how deep the crisis in Europe is. But when they say to me, we want to have nothing to do with these people, they asphyxiated you, look at the way they treated you, we cherish the sovereignty of the House of Commons, we want to get out and write our own laws. At the same time, which is great, at the same time they say we want to stay in the single market. And then I say, what? What is a single market? Single market is not a free trade area. A single market is a lot more than that. A single market requires, first, common industry standards, secondly, common labor protection rules, thirdly, common environmental protection rules. Now, in order to have these, you need common legislation, a common judiciary to police them, and a common executive.
You need to be
in other words, you need the three Montesquieu powers. So you need a common sovereignty, you need a common state. So by leaving, while staying in the single market, you are effectively deferring to an alien force in Brussels which is collapsing because you've left. How clever is this?
It sounds very British. If you think that the whole goal of British foreign policy since time immemorial has been basically to weaken Europe, they're doing a hell of a good job. Let's go global on this one. So one of the funny things that's happened out of the crisis, I mean funny as in peculiar, is people like me and Martin Wolf of the Financial Times and other people said, this strategy to try and make everybody a bit more like Germany isn't going to work. You can't scale it up. They're not all net exporters. You can't imagine Europe running a surplus against the rest of the world. We were wrong. It turns out the Eurozone is now running a surplus against the rest of the world. That's kind of weird, because Asia is running a surplus against the rest of the world, which means the only bit that isn't is the United States.
And Britain.
And Great Britain, of course, but these days they're a bit small, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, what that means is, for the whole system to work, the rest of the world has to run a surplus, which is then paid for by American paper that yields nothing.
There is another solution, you know. Intergalactic trade.
That's true. When we get to Mars, we open up the Martian market.
Klingons and all that.
Yeah, all the Klingons, you can't trust them.
Yeah, you may think that I'm joking, but the reason why I'm making this point is because the objection to your point, just goes to show the absurdity of the kind of arguments we're having in Europe.
Yeah.
When they're saying to us that the periphery will have to become competitive, and notice the fundamental, profound difference between productive and competitive. Productive is something we can all be more of, but we can all be more competitive. So when they are saying that the south of Europe has to become more competitive through net exports, effectively what they are saying is that we need to crush the rest of the world. We need to export deflation to the rest of you. And this is why the American administration, Jack Lew and so on, are livid with the Eurozone.
Precisely for this point. So if the whole world is doing this game, A, they've got to want to sit on American paper yielding nothing for a long time to keep it stable, which they don't want to do. And then the other side of this, which becomes even more peculiar, is if you don't like that, the Americans themselves are having a bit of a fraught election, you might have noticed, and the mainstream view is we need to balance our budget. Now, if the Americans balance their budget at a time when everybody else is running a surplus, this ends really badly.
They would never do that. The Americans are too pragmatic to do this.
You heard it here. They're never going to balance a budget. Now, if that's the case, do we ultimately still rely on America to keep the whole show afloat? Is it the Americans that are sustaining this? How do we think about this globally?
Well,
what's the end game on all of this?
The Americans, this is a very interesting issue, because between the the inauguration of Bretton Woods and the late 60s, America was a net exporter. It was a surplus nation, but it understood that in order to stabilize the global design that it created, they have to recycle that surplus. That's the Marshall Plan. This is the largesse towards Japan, and so on and so forth. At some point, they stopped having a surplus, so they couldn't keep this thing together, so they jettisoned Bretton Woods with the Nixon shock in '71. And then they did what you were alluding to. Paul Volcker, who is my hero in certain ways, in responding to something Kissinger had asked him in 1970, I believe. And the question that typical Kissinger question was, Paul, how can we maintain our dominance as the United States of America, given that we've lost our surplus? And Paul Volcker responded beautifully, saying, well, we have to recycle other people's surpluses through the current account deficit. Mm-hmm. So the United States became a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking into its territory the net exports of everybody else, China, and later on, initially Germany, Japan, and so on, and the capital. Yep. And the profits of all those people who were voluntarily sending as tributes to Wall Street their profits because they were getting a better net return after inflation. So America was doing this. It was the great recycler of the world's surpluses up until 2008. The tragedy was that what happens when $5 billion net goes into Wall Street every day? This tsunami goes in every day to Wall Street. Bankers in Wall Street find a way of levering it up, of turning it into huge amounts of paper money. Mm-hmm. That was financialization. When those pyramids collapsed in 2008, something broke in this global model. The capacity of Wall Street and the American economy to recycle other people's surpluses broke down. And this is why we have the secular stagnation that Larry Summers is talking about. And this is why America cannot perform this role anymore.
So if it's not going to perform it, the Eurozone trying to run a surplus, Asia has to run a surplus because that was their reaction to the '97 shock. Mm-hmm. What's the end game? How does it play out? Because if America's not playing that stabilizing role through recycling these surpluses, what happens?
Well, we keep heading south. We keep having this inexorable process taking us to the perfect storm of collapsing commodity prices, oil prices, of a dollar that is going up at a time when emerging markets, Brazil, China, and so on and so forth, are replete in dollar-denominated debt. Mm-hmm. We have a Eurozone that is exporting to inflation, and nothing good can be the result of this process.
Right. Well, I'm going off for a drink early today. Tell me something positive. All right. Let's imagine a world in which you get to do something different.
Okay.
You've got the keys to the Eurozone. You're in charge. Fix it.
Okay. Well, first thing I would do, I would recalibrate quantitative easing. Instead of using 65 billion a month to purchase bonds that destroy the pension funds in Germany, and to purchase mortgages that push house prices up, doing nothing productive, would bring together the European Central Bank and the European Investment Bank under the auspices of the European Union Council, and say the European Union Council, which owns the European Investment Bank, and say to the European Investment Bank, okay, from now on, you are going to be responsible for a Green New Deal, which invests 5 to 6% of euro area GDP in new sustainable technologies, green energy, and so on and so forth. You do this by issuing your own bonds, which they are doing already, but in large quantities. And then I would say to Draghi, and you buy those bonds. Only those bonds, not bonds, not Spanish debt, none of that. That way, you have, I wouldn't call it people's QE, but I would call it investment-led recovery growth using the two pillars. On the one hand is the pillar of monetary stability with the central bank, and the pillar of development and growth, which should be the investment bank. That's the first thing I would do. But beyond that, I think we need a new Bretton Woods. I think we need to recover John Maynard Keynes' idea of a clearing union. And we can do it now, because now, Keynes didn't have the technology to do it in 1944 when he was proposing it. But now we can have a blockchain kind of digital world currency. We could call it the Cosmos. And we can have an exchange rate between all our currencies and that. And we can penalize both deficits and surpluses by and therefore creating an international sovereign wealth fund, which then recycles the surpluses and the deficits in a way that effectively does what the World Bank ought to be doing, but hasn't been. So that's the quick answer to your question of how we fix the world.
Great. Now, what do you think the net probability of anybody adopting those policies are in the current moment?
I have a master's degree in mathematical statistics, and the one thing I've learned through that process, educational experiences, never specify subjective probabilities of belief.
Fair enough. But let's stick with belief before I want to open it up to questions, because I'm sure people have got some questions for you. Just one more. So you want to be in, but you understand that it's falling apart. You know exactly what it takes to save it. And although it sounds like a lot, given how much has been done in a bad direction and how much worse it could get, it's really actually small beer, and it should be done. Now, at the heart of all of this, you believe deeply in democracy. And you're involved in a new movement which has been launched in Europe called DIEM25, Democracy and European Union Movement for 2025.
As in Carpe Diem.
Carpe Diem, yeah. Seize the moment. And it puts a great deal of faith in the power of ordinary people, and perhaps through technologies, etc., to rip away the veil of secrecy, which has governed the way that the European Union is being governed, ECOFIN, so on and so forth. Now, as an American, I'll put on my American hat for a moment. That was my really bad American accent. We've got Trump just now, and we've got all sorts of crazy stuff going on. And those center parties, which have gotten us into a lot of trouble, nonetheless did provide the foundation of political stability in Europe for 50 years. And we could be going off in a bad direction. Why should we have so much faith in the public and in the process of democracy when it can be so easily led astray?
Well, the answer was provided by Winston Churchill. Faith in the public is a terrible thing to have, but it's better than all the alternatives. I grew up in a dictatorship. My parents grew up in a dictatorship. And I much rather put my faith in the capacity of the demos, of all of us, to get together, knowing that individually we do not have the answers, and try to synthesize what we bring to the table into a common approach to our common problems. I much rather put my faith in that, however misplaced it might be, than to put my faith in some dictator. Or, even worse, some European Union shadowy apparatchik.
Fair enough. And with that, I think I'd like to open it up to questions. Do we have microphones around? Where are they? Someone running around with mics? Yeah, okay, great. So do we have some hands? Who wants to ask a question? Gentleman at the back, right up there.
Would you be able to discuss the dichotomy between what is still felt in Europe, that there is a Northern Europe, rich, and a Southern Europe, poor, with structural economic issues, higher unemployment, maybe organizational issues within the macroeconomy that is still not on par with Northern Europe?
Tell us about structural reform. That's what that always falls under.
Look, I come from a country that needs a lot of reform. When I first moved to Greece in the year 2000 from Australia, I had hair then, but I was pulling it because I just couldn't believe the bureaucracy. I couldn't believe the inanity of the way that the system worked. But I can assure you that you cannot reform a country under a dark cloud of debt deflation. In order to reform and to improve the bureaucracy and to attack sources of corruption and all that, you need hope. You need people that will make some sacrifices as a part of this reform process to believe that things will get better. When everyone expects that something that costs 10 today will cost 9 tomorrow and 8 the day after, and that their salaries are going to be reduced while their debts go up, then I can assure you that that is a recipe for failure at all levels. Now, as for the point you made about a rich north and a poor south, look, every country, every jurisdiction, every city has surplus and deficit regions, poor and rich neighborhoods. What brings a nation together, what brings a society together, is the institutions that we put in place that provide guaranteed income for some, that provide a net, and provide the constituents of the dream of shared prosperity. Without that, you can't go anywhere.
Another question. Looking there. This guy first. There we are. Thank you.
Hi from me. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. Ashley Warren from Armstrong Economics. You say that the European Union it's not working as it is, and obviously we see many countries negative interest rates. Would you agree that, with our blog, that we have to crash and burn before politicians will admit they've made a mistake? Thank you.
I'm very coy to endorse the crash and burn strategy, because the last time we crashed and burned in Europe, we produced the Holocaust, we produced tens of millions of dead people all around the world. And even though the 1950s was a golden age of the global capitalist world, personally, I don't think I have the moral authority to say that we need to sacrifice, or we can or ought to sacrifice a whole generation so that something better can come out of it. I think it is our moral duty to put an end to this disintegration process. Will we succeed? It doesn't matter. You know what? I mean, death is sure. That doesn't mean we shouldn't wake up every morning full of joy about life and optimism, which is based on no evidence whatsoever.
There goes my game plan then. Do we have mindless optimism's kept me going for quite some time. Do we have another question? Yes, right there, down in the front.
What is your strategy to change the reputation of the national sport of Greece, which is
of the what? Of
national sport of Greece, which is the corruption and the tax evasions? That was described by Greek politicians.
Well, interestingly, the crisis has reduced corruption because there is a lot less dough to go around. But no. Well, let me share a story with you. Let me share a story that's very painful to me. The first thing that I tried to do outside the realm of negotiations, something internal within my ministry, was to use a unique opportunity that we had in 2015 to catch tax cheats for the last 20 years. Those who were cheating on taxes for 20 years. The reason why we had this opportunity was I managed to twist the arm of the bankers to get digital data sets with all transactions for the last 20 years within the Greek banking system and between the Greek banking system and foreign banking systems. You know, it took 2-3 months of arm wrestling to get this data. And the idea was to put this together algorithmically with tax returns and have an algorithm tell you, sort of flag potential cases of major discrepancies between tax transactions of particular tax file numbers and what was declared by those tax file numbers. And this was something that was highly doable, right? To my horror, our troika of lenders, who supposedly are the ones that are pushing Greece towards reforms, did everything in their power to stop this. Subterraneanly, illicitly. They controlled the Secretariat for Public Revenues in my former ministry, and I got no cooperation from my own Department of Public Revenues on this, and I have it on good authority that they were in cahoots with the Troika. Why? Because the greatest supporters of the Troika in Greece are the oligarchs. They are the ones who run the media. They are the ones who run the bankrupt banks. that rely on loans from the bailout fund. So a country that was on the verge of a revolution, of people saying, you know what, it's about time that we turn a page. They were, I can assure you that those who voted us in wanted an end to corruption. They didn't vote us in order to maintain the corruption. They were sick and tired. They were the victims of corruption. And to be crushed by a troika, which in the name of reforming Greece, stopped us from doing this. And just to end my story, I resigned on the 6th of July. On the 20th of July, the working group that I had created between the two departments, the IT department of my ministry and the public revenues department, was disbanded. And then in the memorandum that the Troika imposed upon the government, it was explicitly stated that the unit that I had created in order to fight that and to catch those cheats, and we're talking about 500,000 cheats, that would be disbanded and absorbed in the public revenues department. At that moment, you realize that the unholy alliance between the corrupt oligarchy and the reforming troika is just a very difficult enemy to defeat.
Definitely. One more question, gentleman there at the front.
Hi, thank you for a very honest discussion. Just a quick question. Given
I'm not being paid enough to lie.
You're not having any of mine, I'll tell you that much.
Given some of the common global issues that we face through environment, through corruption, through currency, you mentioned perhaps a global currency resetting of Bretton Woods. What's your view on a form of global governance? Do you see parts of governance being ceded by countries and we're moving more towards a framework of global governance in the world?
I very much fear that we're moving in the wrong direction, exactly the opposite direction. We're moving towards the 19th century, a version of the 19th century where everything boils down to power relations and not to governance. Look, after 2008, the emerging markets refloated global capitalism through a great deal of borrowing from the banks, the central banks that were issuing easy money. The West, Europe and the United States were therefore given 5 or 6 years to get their act together. They failed. Because in the final analysis, speaking of governance, both Europe and the United States are ungovernable. The United States is clearly ungovernable. At least they have automated mechanisms which allow the country to do well. But in terms of the political regime, the political class in America, you have a constitution that ensures, more or less, that the White House will be vetoing Congress and Congress will be vetoing the White House. So ungovernability is embedded in the US Constitution. In Europe, the less I say, the better. Yeah? So the West failed to use the space and the time that the emerging markets created for global capitalism. And now the chickens are coming home to roost in the emerging markets, and the United States and Europe have not managed to extract themselves from the previous crisis while the new crisis is hitting them. So this failure of governance is not auguring well for the kind of global governance model that you are alluding to, which is, of course, the only way of managing the planet in a rational way.
Well, let's hope that this audience and other audiences listen to some of those points, take them in, and we start moving in the right direction. I, for one, don't have a vote in Britain, but if I did, you would convince me to stay in, even though I too would be in the box going, go on, just to stick it to them. But
that's right.
I can't. It's been a pleasure, Yanis. Thank you very much.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.